Hello and welcome back to Infamous Indie. I'm your host, That Dead Girl, and if this is your first time joining me, basically what I do here is I sit down with you all and I share with you a true crime story from my home state of Indiana. Last week we kind of started talking about the Sylvia Likens story, and it's definitely not an easy story to talk about, and that is why last week I gave a little bit of a disclaimer, and I will be doing that this week as well. And actually, this week we are really going to be getting down into some pretty gnarly stuff. So, again, if that is something that you feel like you can't handle or don't want to hear about, now would be the time to turn this video off and watch something else. So, with that being said, let's just get right down into it. This is part 2 of the Sylvia Likens story. Now, I did just kind of want to start off by adding in a few little important details that I feel like I missed in the first video. So, we're just going to go ahead and get that out of the way now. I think it's really important to note that Gertrude Maniszewski did not run a very typical household. I mean, for lack of a better word, she basically was running a neighborhood flophouse. It said that you could often find many young neighborhood children hanging out at Gertrude's place, especially young boys. Now, being the wonderful role model she is, of course, Gertrude is giving these young children and teenagers, beer and cigarettes. And also, she loved to sit around and tell these young kids dirty jokes. She would talk to them about sex and, just all kinds of inappropriate things that you would not want an adult to be talking to your child about. So basically, at Gertrude's house, you could do all of the things that, your parents would never allow you to do. I feel like it was important to just go ahead and stick that in there because I felt like I didn't mention that enough in the first video. So at all these times when Sylvia and Jenny are being abused, there's often a large audience. Not only do you have Gertrude's children, but you also have these other neighborhood kids as well. And the second thing I did want to talk about that I kind of feel like I left out of the first video is there was a little bit more to that church incident story. Basically, they go to a church dinner and Jenny and Sylvia are just famished. They're starving, like I said. There's really no food in this house. So they're at this dinner, they eat all this food. Paula brings it to Gertrude's attention that, hey, they're trying to make you look bad because look at them. They're eating all of this food in front of all these people, making them think that we're not feeding them or taking care of them, basically. As I mentioned in the first video, Sylvia actually did receive a beating, via the fraternity style wooden paddle that Gertrude often liked to use. So, as I said, in Gertrude's mind, she's thinking that Sylvia is out to get her. Somehow Sylvia is just out to ruin her reputation. When in reality, Sylvia is doing nothing of the sort. She's basically just starving to death. As if the beating with a paddle wasn't enough, Gertrude decides that if Sylvia is so hungry, well, she's gonna feed her. So Gertrude walks over to the refrigerator and she basically begins preparing a hot dog. So Gertrude and her children begin to load up this hot dog with all these different condiments and all these different spices. Gertrude then attempted to force feed this hot dog to Sylvia while all of the Maniszewski children sat around and laughed and made fun of her. Now, I'm not sure of, the exact ingredients of this hot dog or whatever, but it sounds gross. It's being forcefully fed to her. So Sylvia begins to vomit. And this just pissed Gertrude off. So she shoves Sylvia to the ground and begins to force her to scoop up the remnants of the hot dog, vomit and all, and forces her to eat it. And as she's forcing Sylvia to do this, she proclaims, "We don't waste food." So I definitely just wanted to jump in and add that, into the video because it is important to know that during this time, mid-August, this is when Gertrude's abuse really starts to get dark and starts to escalate. And it was also during this time she began to solely focus all of her abuse onto Sylvia exclusively. According to Jenny Likens, Sylvia actually would take on the brunt of the abuse because she did not want Jenny to be hurt. So, shortly after this incident with the church dinner and the hot dog, Betty and Lester Likens actually returned to town to pay the girls a visit and to check up on them. And I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, their parents are back. They're there to save the day, they're there to take them home. But sadly, that was definitely not the case. Now, Gertrude had found out about this visit in advance, so of course she basically sat the girls down and had a talk with them and threatened them to not say a single word about any of the things that had been going on within her home. And it's easy for me or, pretty much anybody to sit back and say, well, I would have told my parents immediately. I would have told someone what was going on. I can only assume that this was just the type of psychological effect that Gertrude had on these young girls. They were obviously very, very afraid. I feel like they were afraid that maybe they wouldn't be believed, and I also feel that they were afraid of being caught. They've endured all of this abuse already, so what would be the extent of the abuse or the punishment if they were to get caught telling someone about Gertrude? So basically, Betty and Lester come into town. The girls go out with them for a few hours. They tell them everything's wonderful, everything is fine. And Betty and Lester go back on the road, leaving their girls behind, thinking that, everything's okay. Now, as I said before, there would be, these huge outbursts of anger and abuse towards Jenny and Sylvia. And then there would be almost like these cool down periods where everything would kind of seem normal and no abuse would occur. During one of these cool down periods, as I'm going to call them, Jenny and Sylvia are actually sitting around with Paula and Stephanie and a few other neighborhood girls, and they're kind of having, some girl talk, if you will. So they're all sitting around, and Paula is kind of teasing Sylvia. She's like, oh, you've never had a boyfriend. I bet you've never even kissed a boy. So it's then that Sylvia reveals that during her time in California, she had actually had a boyfriend while she was living there. So Paula's just like, oh, well, did you kiss him? What did you do? How far did you go with him? So Sylvia basically admits to not only kissing him, but also kind of letting him fill her up. And whether any of this was actually true or not remains to be seen. I could definitely see it being a situation in where Sylvia was just trying to maybe over exaggerate to seem cool to these older girls. Whatever the case may be, Gertrude overhears this conversation, and needless to say, she goes into a fit of rage. So Gertrude basically just begins berating Sylvia. She goes on to scream about the house that Sylvia must be pregnant because she let a boy touch her vagina. In which obviously you or I know that that's just absolutely ridiculous, but I digress. Gertrude then began attacking Sylvia, beating her up and actually kicking her in her vagina several times. After Gertrude finished her beating, Sylvia would attempt to go sit down in a chair. Obviously, she's been kicked several times. She's in a lot of pain. Paula would then grab Sylvia and throw her out of the chair, saying, you ain't fit to sit in chairs. And from that moment on, Sylvia was not allowed to sit anywhere in the house, in a chair, on a couch, anything, without asking for permission first. It's just unbelievable. And this treatment of Sylvia over this conversation about this boy is just completely hypocritical to me. Here you have, virtuous Gertrude, who's had several failed marriages. She's sleeping with a man 12 years younger than her. And then you have her daughter, Paula. And at this point in time, Paula Baniszewski was actually about 3 months pregnant. It turns out that Paula had been having an affair with a much older married man and actually had gotten pregnant. She actually tried to hide this pregnancy from Gertrude for quite some time, and it's said that Sylvia was actually one of the first and only people to know about this. And that would be the lovely train that passes by my house every 20 minutes on Saturdays and Sundays. And like I said, it's still very much unknown why Gertrude would have this sort of reaction to Sylvia's story about this boy. A lot of people say that, Gertrude was basically just jealous of Sylvia's youth and beauty. And then there are others who say because of her living conditions and her state of life at this point in time, she had some sort of mental break. Whatever the reason may be, Gertrude pretty much justified her attacks on Sylvia by just claiming that she was a filthy prostitute. She would actually deliver these bizarre speeches to her children and other neighborhood kids about, the filthiness of women and how Sylvia was a filthy prostitute and a sinner and just all this other fucking crazy shit. So the day after the whole prostitute, you're pregnant, kick you in the crotch thing, the girls all go back to school the next day as normal. Which brings me to the next thing. I've heard several different tellings of this particular, I guess, part of the story. So I'm kind of just going to go based off what I know and what I've read. So it's the next day at school, and a lot of people have said that Sylvia and Jenny actually started to spread rumors about Paula and Stephanie. So apparently they had gone around school telling everybody that Paula and Stephanie were actually having sex with boys in exchange for money. And a lot of people have actually said that this was absolutely not true, that Sylvia and Jenny would never stoop to their level. But either way, Sylvia would go on to suffer the consequences of this rumor. Stephanie Baniszewski's boyfriend, Coy Hubbard, who was about 15 years old at the time, would actually hear about these rumors at school that day. So right after school, he headed directly to the Baniszewski house. When he arrived at the house, he basically began interrogating Sylvia, asking her, if she had said these things, and basically he was really pissed off. So when Sylvia wasn't giving him the answers he wanted, he began to literally beat the shit out of her. And there were actually several witnesses to this incident, as well as basically all of the other incidents that have gone on and will go on inside this house. But no one says anything. No one does anything to stop this abuse that's happening. And after the incident with the rumor and the beating of Sylvia, Coy Hubbard would go on to be, basically a resident hangout at the Baniszewski house. He was even encouraged by Gertrude to practice his judo on Sylvia. Basically meaning he used her as a punching bag. Literally. And just when you think shit can't get any worse for Sylvia, it does. And as I've mentioned, all of the neighborhood kids hung out at the Baniszewski house because basically you could do whatever the hell you wanted without consequence. And it was around this time that Gertrude actually began manipulating Sylvia's best friend, Anna Cisco. So somehow Gertrude is able to get inside this little girl's head and manipulate her into believing that Sylvia actually went around school and the neighborhood telling everyone that her mother was a whore. The next day, Gertrude invites Anna back to the house and she forces her to confront Sylvia about this lie that she's made up. She then directs her in a very violent attack on Sylvia. This little girl is scratching Sylvia's face, ripping her hair out, slapping her around. And Gertrude is just encouraging this behavior. Just days after the incident and the fight with Anna, Gertrude then convinces Paula's friend, Judy Duke, of this same rumor that, Sylvia's been going around town calling your mother a whore. Gertrude pitted the girls against each other in a fist fight. And during this fist fight between Paula Duke and Sylvia Likens, Gertrude actually tries to force Jenny Likens to punch Sylvia. Obviously Jenny refuses. This is her sister. She's absolutely not going to punch her. So Gertrude basically begins to beat Jenny in the face with her fists until she finally agrees to stand up and punch Sylvia in the stomach. Now you may be wondering, did anybody else witness, the abuse of Jenny and Sylvia during this time? In late August 1965, a family actually moved into the vacant residence next to the Baniszewski house. Phyllis and Raymond Vermillion had settled in and, they kind of saw what was going on over at the Baniszewski house. They saw that Gertrude constantly had a lot of children in her care. So Phyllis thought, hey, my husband and I both work. What if I proposition this woman to take care of our two children while we're at work as well? And Phyllis also thought it was a good idea because she would be helping Gertrude out financially by paying her, for her services. So the Vermillions had, planned this backyard barbecue type thing so that the two families could sit down and meet and kind of discuss a babysitting arrangement. So during this barbecue, Phyllis notices Sylvia, and basically Sylvia is just wandering around the backyard in a daze with a very pronounced black eye. And this is when Paula chimes in proudly, telling everybody that she is the one that gave Sylvia this black eye. At the same barbecue, Gertrude goes and gets a steaming hot glass of water and demands that Paula throw it in her face to wake her up. Phyllis and Raymond Vermillion saw this going on at their own barbecue, and yet they did not report this incident. About 2 months later, Phyllis had actually gone to the Baniszewski house to, borrow some sugar or something like that. In just the few moments that she was there, she would see Sylvia walking around the living room um, with another black eye, and this time her eye was almost swollen shut. So Paula, obviously, is the one that had, again, given Sylvia a black eye. So she actually begins to demonstrate to Phyllis how she did it. She takes off her belt and her belt buckle and she begins to beat Sylvia right in front of Phyllis. So Phyllis Vermillion, she's seen Sylvia walking around with black eyes, so bad that her eye is swollen shut. She's seen Paula beat her with a belt. She's seen them throw steaming hot water in this girl's face. And yet Phyllis Vermillion never reported anything to the authorities. Like, I'm a huge advocate for children, so I could never imagine witnessing this type of treatment and not saying something and not, calling the cops or CPS, just anything. I just can't believe that two seemingly smart adults would just ignore this. Later that week, Sylvia comes home from school and she informs Gertrude that she needs a sweatsuit for gym class or she's gonna fail. Gertrude basically just gets pissed off and tells her, you know what, we can't afford it. So basically, Gertrude wouldn't buy Sylvia the sweatsuit she needed, so she went on to steal one from school. One day, Sylvia had actually forgotten to change out of the sweatsuit, and she came home, and Gertrude freaked out and began asking her all these questions. How did you get the money for that? Where did you get the sweatsuit? You must have stolen it. Basically, just accusing her of anything and everything that she could. She basically accuses Sylvia of sleeping with boys in exchange for money to purchase the sweatsuit, and then would later go on to accuse Sylvia of stealing the sweatsuit. Gertrude throws Sylvia to the ground and begins kicking her in the stomach, kicking her in the vagina, yelling at her, and calling her a filthy prostitute. She beats Sylvia so hard that finally Sylvia just confesses to stealing the gym uniform from the school. So, as we know, the physical beating just wasn't enough for someone like Gertrude. She had to dish out an even sicker punishment to, teach Sylvia not to steal. And she would actually go on to burn the tips of each of Sylvia's fingers with a lit cigarette. And from that moment on, everyone in the Baniszewski house that smoked would just arbitrarily put their cigarettes out on Sylvia as a reminder not to steal. So at this point in the story, I think it's around mid-September, and Sylvia actually had started collecting Coca-Cola bottles again to recycle. Now, it's said that she was doing this because she wanted to try to save up money to get her and Jenny a bus ticket so that they could leave the Baniszewski residence. Unfortunately for Sylvia, Paula and Stephanie had actually witnessed her going around picking up these glass bottles, so of course they run home and they tell their mother Gertrude. Gertrude went on her same old spiel that, Sylvia was a prostitute and she deserved to be punished. She made all of her sons and several neighborhood boys gather around as she forced Sylvia to strip naked. So obviously Sylvia does not want to do this. This is just a completely humiliating situation, and she's begging Gertrude, please, please, I don't want to get naked in front of all these people. So Gertrude then threatens to beat Jenny Likens instead. So Sylvia eventually goes on, like I said, to strip naked in front of Gertrude's sons and all of these neighborhood boys. Once Sylvia was completely naked, Gertrude would hand her a glass Coca-Cola bottle. She would then force Sylvia to masturbate with the glass Coca-Cola bottle in front of her sons and all of the neighborhood boys. Now, I'm not 100% certain, but I do believe that this bottle actually would end up breaking inside of Sylvia right in the middle of this act. And shortly after the incident with the Coca-Cola bottle, Sylvia would actually become incontinent. As a result of her incontinence, Gertrude, basically thought that Sylvia wasn't fit to live with other humans anymore, and she actually condemned her to the basement of the home. Now, obviously, there's no toilet or anything like that down in this basement, and Sylvia is incontinent at this point, so she's urinating and defecating all over the basement, all over herself. This is also when Gertrude began referring to Sylvia as Dirty Girl, completely disregarding that she had a name at all. Gertrude also began a bathing regimen for Sylvia because of the incontinence, and also she claimed that she was washing away Sylvia's filthy sins. This regimen consisted of Gertrude filling her clawfoot bathtub up with scalding hot water. I mean, so hot that it was actually burning Sylvia's skin. Basically, they would bind her hands behind her back and her feet and ankles as well, and they would dunk her face first into this tub of scalding hot water. Now, when Gertrude was finished bathing Sylvia, she would have Paula come in and then rub iodized salt all over Sylvia's nude body. Which, as you can imagine, salt on your skin is pretty uncomfortable to begin with, but keep in mind that they've all been beating her and putting their cigarettes out on her, so she's got several open wounds all over her body at this point in time. And it's during this time that a 14-year-old boy named Ricky Hobbs begins to frequently hang out at the Baniszewski house. Basically, Ricky Hobbs would go on to be Gertrude Baniszewski's lapdog. It said that he was basically like Gertrude's personal assistant, especially when it came to dealing with Sylvia. Okay, that was a lot. We definitely covered a lot of ground today, so I think that's a pretty good stopping point for part 2 of this story. And I know I did give a little bit of a disclaimer in part 1 and at the beginning of this video as well, but I do want to say that don't think that this is an easy story for me to tell at all. It's absolutely horrible. It's been definitely an interesting journey. So with that being said, I do know that we talked about a lot of heavy shit today, but just know that it is going to get worse in part 3. I mean, there's just nothing good that's going to come out of this story. In spite of how graphic this story may be, I do just want to thank everybody for tuning in and watching, because I do feel that it's important to keep Sylvia Likens' name alive. And with that being said, I will have part 3 of this story up sometime next Sunday evening for you all. Thank you guys for watching, and if you're new here, definitely be sure to like and subscribe. And remember to stay spooky, keep it creepy, and watch your back, because it's a crazy fucking world out there.